Greetings. A few weeks ago, I made an announcement, or perhaps I uploaded a story on Instagram where I said that a couple of books will be arriving soon. One of them already has. Um, it's by Rene Girard. The book is called Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World. I haven't read this book, but I've read some snippets from it, and it seems very, very interesting. But when I was reading it, I had somewhat of a revelation, so to speak, and it struck me that if we agree with Girard's anthropology and his cultural theory, if we put it that way, it kind of sheds light on many of our mundane and everyday phenomena in a way which we may not have realized before. So let's talk about Girard first. Girard was a anthropologist, a cultural theorist and sociologist from France. He was born in a Catholic family, but like most French of his times, he remained rather indifferent to religious questions. However, Girard's main field of expertise was literature. So he went to England and he studied literature, and he wrote books on Shakespeare and other English writers. But the most interesting thing about Girard is his theory of mimetic rivalry. And to unpack that, it's very difficult to unpack that because it's a very sophisticated topic. But I suppose we can start off by the discussion of desire. So if you look at conventionally what people have said about the differences between humans and animals is that humans have reason. They can contemplate on very complex philosophical and mathematical models, whereas animals, they have reasoning aptitude which is really confined to their bare evolutionary and reproductive needs. However, I think we could say that this may be a little vulgarized understanding of the difference between the two. In fact, one could say that even some animals have some reasoning ability, but it is confined to the fulfillment of their basic needs, right? They don't have the luxury of thinking about algebra, for instance. But Girard argues that a much more subtle and much more significant difference between animals and humans is the idea of desire. Now, desire in Girardian perspective should be understood as desiring something more than your evolutionary needs. So in that sense, animals don't have desire because their needs are confined to what's needed for their survival and for the continuation of their offspring. But humans, Girard argues, are differentiated by other species due to the fact that they have desires. So desires are not inbuilt, they are not genetic, they are not ingrained in our human species. Rather, they come about due to the fact that humans live in cultural societies and they are cultural beings, basically. So, when I was reading that, there is so much wisdom in the earlier traditions, and sometimes we get so oblivious of that wisdom. So here's a quote just on the very preface of the book from Aristotle, and it says that man differs from the other animals in his greater aptitude for imitation. And I think, although Aristotle probably did not realize the theory of mimetic rivalry as argued by Girard, but nevertheless he's made a very concise and succinct observation which I think serves to prove the whole thesis of Girard. So humans are differentiated by animals by their greater aptitude for imitation. All living beings imitate, they mimic, and that's how they grow. a cat mimics her mother, for instance, a dog mimic their parents, whatever. All living species mimic, and that's how they really grow up. And human beings also, when we are kids, for instance, we learn languages by simply mimicking what our mothers are, uttering when we are in the lab, for instance. So mimicry or imitation is a very natural process which occurs to all human beings. But again, here there is a difference. Other species imitate only to the extent that is required for their evolutionary growth. There is no imitation beyond that, right? But human beings have different imitations, have greater aptitude for imitations, and this is what Girard argues creates the space for human desires. So Girard argues the most human desires are not natural, rather they are mimetic. Why mimetic? Mimetic in the sense that these desires are triggered when we see someone else having something which we don't have, but because we hold the other person in great esteem, or we are inspired by him, or perhaps envious of him, this triggers in us the desire to possess the same stuff that the other person possesses. To give a very crude example, I'm not particularly fond of shopping or buying new shoes or clothes, right? But let's suppose that I'm a big fan of football and I rate Lionel Messi very highly, and I'm driving by a highway and I see this huge billboard on the highway with Messi's photo and he's wearing new Adidas shoes. Now, because I actually desire Messi in a sense and actually admire him, what that picture does is that it cultivates in me a certain desire to have and to possess the same shoes. Or let's give it another example. Let's say that you don't happen to have a girlfriend. I mean, that's another crude example, but I think it's on a very basic and everyday level, in a sense that everyone can resonate perhaps. So it's a good example. Let's suppose that you don't happen to have a girlfriend and you're not particularly concerned about it either, but you see a friend of yours having one or spending time and having fun, and that kind of triggers in you the desire to have one. So basically, desires are not natural, they actually are triggered by our greater aptitude for imitation. That's a very simplistic summary of his theory, but I think that does a good job. Now, Girard argues that if a lot of people desire the same stuff, right? Let's say in a society, in a culture, let's say in a country, a lot of people, desire to be president. Certain politicians are running for the same political office, right? They're desiring the same thing, but obviously not all of them can have it. So there is a bit, and let's suppose in this particular country, the democratic process is not all too transparent and concrete, right? So there's always a fear of, there's always a fear that the one who's most popular, the one who's most famous is likely to lose. So there's a degree of uncertainty in society, right? No one knows who will win. And they're desiring the same office, basically. So according to Girard, whenever in a culture or in a society or in a human settlement, a group of people start to desire the same thing, that leaves that particular society with two options. Either it will have a social explosion, and these people will just fight one another off and kill each other off, and there will be a social chaos. Or they could try and figure out a scapegoat from within themselves, some person, some individual, a group perhaps who's more fragile, precarious, and someone who could be made a scapegoat. And Girard argues that that's what happens actually. And so these people who are fighting for the same thing, they single out someone from within themselves, someone who's in a relatively weaker position, and they accuse that particular person to be the reason for all the social anxiety and all the social chaos. And they basically crucify him. Now, Girard argues that obviously in previous mythologies of whether they're Greek mythologies or in other cultures, myths serve to vindicate the mob, the crucifier, so to speak, whereas the biblical narrative serves to vindicate the victim, the scapegoat. I'm not going to go into that detail right now because I will do another video on this. But in fact, I would write an article on why the biblical narrative actually created the modern concern for the victims, because it's so it exposes this scapegoating mechanism, and it vindicates the victim rather than taking the perspective and taking the side of the mob, of the violent mob. But let's try to assess this theory, right? This is his theory, and this never occurred to me before. But I come from I hail from Pakistan, right? And there is obviously a social chaos in the country. There's financial insecurity. There's a lot of other problems. But religion is a particularly important impulse in our country, much more so than it is in Europe. And as you know, the religious people are scattered into different denominations, Sunni, Shia, different subsects within the Sunni Islam. So I've noticed something, and this struck me during the last month of Ramadan, which is the Islamic month where the Muslims keep fast and offer prayers and become very pious for a limited span of time. And during this month, you will watch on television extravagant television shows where former actors turned religious preachers would organize programs where they will invite clerics from all the different religious traditions, from all the different sects, basically, all Islamic sects. And you'll see that all these people sitting in that studio, they desire the same thing. They claim that all of them have possessed the true pristine interpretation of the religion, right? And they're desiring that same purity of faith that all of them are desiring, right? They all desire the same thing. And they all consider each other as deviant or infidel, basically. They all consider each other as kafirs. So the funny thing is that either they would fight each other off, right, and unleash this sort of social explosion and chaos, or they can pinpoint a person from within the society upon whom they can put all the blame. So invariably, all the time in these television shows, the discussion, when it gets too complicated, too intense, too sectarian, so to speak, it boils down to how bad Ahmadis are. So the Ahmadis are basically a Muslim, is an Islamic sect that emerged in the 19th century, and it's not considered Muslim by most of the Muslims in Pakistan. So what they do is that they try to accuse this very small minority of people of being responsible for the financial crisis, for corrupting the religion, and so on and so forth. And upon this particular issue, all of them unify. The Shia, the Sunni, the Deobandi, the Barelvi, the Ahle Hadith, all of them unify, right? Who otherwise are extremely aggressive and hostile to one another. So this is a Girardian understanding of something which never occurred to me before, because I wasn't aware of this mind-blowing thesis and this mind-blowing theory. But when you look at it, it explains so many things. And I think this is really, really interesting phenomenon. And by the way, when it gets over the Ahmadis, when only the Sunnis are invited on a television show, when only they are discussing certain things, Of course, they too have a hostile attitude towards each other, the different sects within the Sunni tradition. So what they do is that in order to settle the dispute, they eventually, start accusing the Shias to be the source of the problem. And Shias also are, well, not as small a minority as Ahmadis, but still constitute only 15% of the Pakistan's population, and the rest 85% happen to be Sunni or so. So this is a Girardian perspective of looking at things, that when you feel as if even in your own mundane conversations you happen to have a very intense or aggressive relation with someone, it sometimes does occur that two of you come to an agreement, and that agreement is that we may have our disagreement, but that third person is a total maniac, is a very bad person. So this is how Girard argues that societies overcome this mimetic rivalry. And I think that's a really, really revolutionary way of looking at human cultures and how they evolve.